Back at the Republican National Convention, the first night was devoted to the economy, which was not surprising, but the primetime speaking slot for the head of the Teamsters Union was.
You know, corporatists hate when working people join together to form unions. But for a century, major employers have waged a war against labor by forming corporate unions of their own. We need to call the Chamber of Commerce and the business roundtables what they are. They are unions for big business.
The sentiment in those remarks was different than the other first night speakers who beat up on the economic performance under Joe Biden. Instead, the Teamsters president was talking about systemic inequalities in the American economy, kept in place by corporations whose lobbyists and executives funded and attended the Republican convention. Though there has been a great deal of discussion about individual economic indicators this election, we thought we'd try to address some of the larger questions raised by O'Brien's speech. And so for that, Neil Malhotra joins me now. He's a professor of political economy at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. Thank you so much for being with us. So the basic premise of the American economy is that hard work and perseverance can lead to success. What's the status of that promise now relative to what it once was?
Well, if you kind of go back to the 1950s and 60s, the post-World War II economy, for example, not having a college degree didn't mean that you were going to be a member of the economic underclass. You had a pathway to succeed in the American economy. Real wages were increasing over time. And then, starting about the 1980s, for many complex factors, kind of the basic American worker, especially people, the working class without college degrees, have been having a harder time. And there has been progress made in recent years, but for many people, that's still not enough, especially in an era of persistently high inflation, high housing prices, et cetera.
So the unemployment rate is still under 4%. Historically, that's a pretty good number. So why, and is this, so what's the economic reason, or is it an expectation reason for what the Teamsters president talked about, which is that even though the unemployment level is low, Americans can't win, as he put it?
Yeah, it must frustrate people in the Biden administration, particularly members of his economic team, that they've made a bunch of economic progress on indicators, but the feeling of the American public is still negative. And one reason is of human psychology. So psychologists have taught us that when people do well, they attribute that to their individual skill and success. And then when people do poorly, they attribute it to external factors. So people have seen an increase in their wages, but because of inflation, they haven't seen an increase in their standard of living. So you can kind of understand if somebody was making $50,000 a year and now they're making $70,000, but their life doesn't seem any better, they could be reasonably upset by something like that.
What do you make of this number? So 80 years ago, more than 90% of Americans were financially better off than their parents. Today, only 50% of Americans can say the same. Is that a real blow to the American conception of opportunity, or is that, again, back into that perception point you were making earlier?
I mean, I think an expectation of Americans, and this is immigrants, it's new Americans, old Americans, is that their children will have better lives than them. And it's part of the American dream. And one of the reasons I think people don't perceive that's a possibility anymore is that they don't view themselves in an era of abundance, but they view themselves as an era of scarcity. So things just seem scarce. There's not enough houses to buy, not enough train lines and highway lines are being built, not enough energy is being produced. So whereas we had prior eras of American society, which were seen as abundant and full of opportunity, people just don't see that kind of future for their children. And it may contribute to why people are having fewer children. They don't see an abundant world to send children out into.
As of 2022, half of the families in the U.S. only own 2% of the wealth in the country. Does that point to a specific weakness in American opportunity or another economic weakness in the economic system at the moment?
Well, I think economic inequality is a complicated concept because John F. Kennedy used to say that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what that meant is that even if you had an increase in inequality, it still could be okay as long as everybody was doing well. But I think people are getting the sense now that only a certain portion of people are doing better, especially people that already own a lot of assets and own a lot of capital. But for people that want to enter the economy, who want to grow their own net worth, it's becoming more challenging, and that some people might be left at the bottom of the economic sea. So inequality necessarily isn't a bad thing, but if people see that it sort of decreases equality of opportunity, that's when people start getting concerned.
And finally, Professor, at the last question, and it's not an easy one, but it's a presidential year. If the voters could keep the two candidates focused on 1, 2, or 3 issues to get at this question of improving American opportunity, or what should they focus on? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think you saw the president already talk about one of these things, which is how to keep housing prices under control. So although it is a controversial proposal, the idea of having some way to incentivize landlords to cap rents. And then I think on the Republican side, it'll be interesting to see how they use things like immigration to maybe stem that, to kind of keep wages high among certain sectors of the economy. And I think the fact that the Teamsters president is at the Republican convention is a sign that both parties are trying to focus on the working class as a pathway to win. There has been times before that the Teamsters have sided with the Republicans under Presidents Nixon and Reagan. And so I think we're just in a very interesting time in American politics right now, which could be subject to realignment of labor and capital.
Right. Neil Malhotra, professor at Stanford University, thanks so much for being with us.